Hello everyone. Today we are going to discuss about one of the finest yet complex abilities that we human beings possess. The ability that helps us to see and understand the world around us. Visual perception. When we talk about the neuropsychological aspect of visual perception, we know that vision is entirely the process of occipital lobe and perception, the seat of perception is parietal lobe. However, when you look at visual perception, is it the combination or it is the functioning of just these two lobes? Certainly not. It takes more than these two lobes to help us to get an understanding or our ability to see the world in its completeness or as a whole. So to understand more about visual perception, let us have a quick look at the visual pathway. Now, from the diagram you can see that our world is entirely divided into two visual fields. The left visual field and the right visual field. Okay. Now, how the world is, even if you are viewing with just one eye, this is how you perceive the world as left and right. Now, how this is projected onto these two eyes. The left visual field is always, this is the left eye, this is the right eye. Left visual field is always projected onto the right side of the retina of both the eyes, and the right visual field is projected onto the left side of the retina. So when you take the midline, whatever is inside close to the midline, it is labeled as the nasal images, and whatever you see outside, it is the temporal image of both the eyes. Now from here, the neurons, the optic nerves gathers the information together. It leaves the retina, and you can see whatever is in the temporal region, it leaves the retina and moves on to the ipsilateral hemisphere, the same side, left. From the left eye, the information moves on to the left hemisphere, and from the right eye, it moves on to the right hemisphere. Whatever is in the nasal portion, it leaves the retina, and at the optic chiasm, it crosses over and moves into the opposite hemisphere. Okay? Once it reaches the posterior and towards the posterior portion of the hemisphere, there it synapses at the lateral geniculate body of both the hemisphere, and from there it radiates. There is a loop here, finally reaching the occipital lobe. From here also it radiates. I will tell you the reason why it radiates, reaching finally the occipital lobe. Right hemisphere, left hemisphere. Now, why it is radiating? Here is where actually our lateral ventricle lies. This is how information reaches the brain. Finally, when it reaches the brain, we can see the entire right visual field is projected onto the left hemisphere, whereas the entire left visual field is projected onto the right hemisphere. Right on the left and left on the right. So does that mean that the information received by both the eyes are entirely different? No. There is a great amount of overlap between the information that reaches both the eyes. However, some amount of information, maybe the extreme ends of the visual, the word that you see, some amount of information is the sole property of the left hemisphere, and some amount of information is the sole property of the right hemisphere. Then how do you see the world as a whole when the information reached onto different hemisphere can be different? It is through the corpus callosum that they exchange information, and finally we see the world as a whole. Now take for example, when you see a movie. For people you are familiar, actors that you are really familiar, First and foremost, the information is processed by the right hemisphere because the information is visual. So for familiar faces and all, you tend to name the person as this particular actor. The left hemisphere do the role of naming those person, and when it comes to new faces, the entire processing is being done by the right hemisphere. Now you can see me in this video. The color I am wearing, it is always perceived by the right hemisphere, and the color, the name you give for this particular kind of color as pink, it is given by the left hemisphere. So both these hemispheres are jointly doing the job so that you can perceive things in a complete whole way. Now take for example when you are reading. So it is purely verbal thing. You are reading a book, but reading takes place through the visual perception. So initially the processing takes place in the right hemisphere, and while you are reading, you must be very, you are not consciously aware, but then you know, you have the scanning movement of the eye. This is being done by the frontal lobe. Frontal lobe has a portion called frontal eye field, which actually helps in the scanning movement of the eye. Now this is actually a diagrammatic representation of just the visual pathway. When you complete the brain diagrammatically, this is actually the axial view that you are getting. Okay. Now from here, you can see it is the temporal lobe. So the temporal lobe is involved in visual perception. Parietal lobe is involved, occipital lobe, frontal actually helping you in the scanning movement of the eye. So this process is completed only with the help of all these lobes playing their own part in the visual perception. Now have a look at this image. Next image. I am going to discuss about what happens when this pathway is damaged. How will you perceive the world? Now suppose there is a damage in this particular area, wherein information from this eye, the right eye, is not reaching the hemisphere, which means at the retina you have the image, but the brain is not able to sense the image. So then what happens for that particular person? There is complete blindness onto the right eye. Information from the right eye is not reaching the hemisphere. So when you take, if these are the two eyes, for that damage in a particular place called A, what you see is total blindness for the right eye because the information is not reaching the brain. Now what happens if the damage happens at the optic chiasm? In the optic chiasm, what is happening is information from both the eyes, the left visual field is not reaching the right hemisphere. Here one information from the left eye, the nasal part is not reaching, and the right eye, the temporal part is not reaching. So what happens is the person will be having blindness like this onto the extreme ends of the eyes. So your vision will be just towards the central, and the peripheral region you will not be having any vision. If that's it, so that kind of blindness is called bitemporal hemianopia. Now what happens if this particular area is damaged? Which means information from the one of the visual field is not reaching the right hemisphere. The left visual field is not reaching the right hemisphere. What happens for a person like that? The blindness will be onto one side. So when there is a blindness onto one side at point C, what happens? This person will not be able to read a book because whenever he takes a page, the left side is missing. You are not able to see. So for you to read, you have to start from the starting point of a line, moves on to the right, then again you have to start with the second line starting point, which a person will never be able to do. And what happens if finally this area is damaged? If both the area of the occipital lobe, the primary projection area, is damaged, the person will end up having total blindness, cerebral blindness, which means retina is there, you are able to see things in the retina, but the brain is never able to perceive it. Why? Because the area which processes visual information is lost forever. The person will never be able to see any of the images. Cerebral blindness. For such patients, even a transplantation of what cornea will not help because the damage is in the brain, and whatever changes you try to make in the eyes will not help the person to see the image. So from the diagrams illustrated, we now know that if any damage happens to the pathway, we definitely will end up having blindness in different parts of the visual field, either in the form of homonymous hemianopia, one side totally absent, or in the form of bitemporal hemianopia, wherein the peripheral region is lost, or even quadrant anopia, wherein one quadrant of the image will not be seen by us. Now, this can be easily detected while in a neuropsychological investigation with a person. The patient is asked to sit with the eyes fixed on a point, and wherever the doctor asks or the neuropsychologist asks to point to the finger placed in the visual field, the person has to point to that place. So, if there is a blindness onto the right side, if the finger is placed here, the person will never be able to point out to that stimulus. So, this is regarding blindness in different parts of the visual field. Now, what happens to visual perception? Now, this is a combined effort of different lobes. So, that means damage to any part in the temporal, parietal or occipital lobe can result in different defects in visual perception, which means whatever you are seeing, there is either partial or complete distortion in images, distortion in what you are seeing. For example, take the case of visual agnosia. What is it? It is inability to recognize any familiar objects that you see, which means I show you this, the person will not be able to name this as a pen or a marker. Is the person is able to see this? Yes, of course, the person is able to see this, but will not be able to name. So there are two kinds, broadly classifying two kinds of agnosia that you can see: perceptual agnosia, perceptive agnosia, and associative agnosia. Perceptive is, like for example, if I show my spectacles to the person will identify one circle, two circle. There is a actually something joining these two circles, and there are two handles. The person would end up naming it as a bicycle instead of a spectacle. So, the person is able to identify the parts but not able to perceive it as a whole. Then the other kind of agnosia is associative type, wherein the person understands that it is spectacles but will not be able to name that. Visual aspect is there, perceptual aspect is there, but naming, the association with the name is lost. So, you get to see different kinds of agnosia. Color agnosia, the person may not be able to, they are able to see different colors as different colors, but they are not able to name different colors. How do you detect it? Ask them to color the national flag of India. Any child would know to place the colors, but when they look at the different crayons, colors or different colors in the palette, they are not able to identify each color. So what happens, they end up drawing instead of saffron some other color. Or for example, ask them, give a drawing of a human figure and ask them to color the hair. Normally any child would color with black, but then the person is not able to identify black as black and end up having color agnosia. There is an agnosia for faces, prosopagnosia, which means the person is able to identify the face as a face but will not be able to identify whose face is this, to whom does this particular face belong. To the extent that when they see their own mirror image, they will not be identified them seeing the person in the mirror as themselves. So that is prosopagnosia. So you can, based on visual perceptual difficulties, you tend to have different kinds of agnosia, and you have reading disability, wherein you are able to identify even alphabets and words but unable to read, alexia. In movies you must have seen people jokingly saying that I can read, I can understand what you say but cannot read, but then there is a difficulty wherein you are able to write but not read. So writing difficulty is an entirely different thing. Reading difficulty is an entirely different phenomena by the brain. So a person able to write their own name, my name is so and so, once after writing it, they are not able to read it. So that is called alexia. So apart from these disturbances in visual perception, either partial or complete, there are also other difficulties wherein the inputs that you receive, the stimulus that you receive is either seen in a distorted form or is completely absent and you tend to perceive things. That is called illusion and hallucination respectively. Illusion, you tend to see a rope as a snake. So there is misinterpretation of your visual perception. And the last thing which I said, hallucination. You don't have a stimulus, but then you tend to see images, hallucination, absence of a stimulus creating a sensation of visual perception. So if it is in the temporal lobe, you tend to see people, objects as hallucination. But if the damage is entirely in the occipital lobe, the images that you see is not person or object, rather circles, flames, triangles and things like that. So that is called elementary hallucination. So based on different areas damaged, you tend to have different kind of perceptual difficulties. Now, why do neuropsychologists need to understand all this? A structural understanding of the brain is very essential so that you will understand what are the difficulties faced by the person, so that it will help you to provide better rehabilitation or better cognitive training for the person so that they are able to adapt to the world.